Oh my gosh, I think I'm live. Am I live? Hi everyone. It has been so long since I have gone live. I can't even remember what I am doing. There I am. Okay, so there's no topic coming up. I wish my chair would move, roll across this floor, but it won't, and that's okay. I've decided to communicate safety to my brain as much as I can and immerse myself in the things I used to do, like showing up and doing a live. So then my brain might go, oh yeah, I remember who I am. I remember who we are. So here I am, and I'm going to talk about how we skip around safety in school settings for neurodivergent children. So I was thinking this morning as I was doing some training on trauma, and, you know, we are always working as a business to be trauma informed within intersectional communities. So that's going to look different for so many different identities and cultures, and that's what we're working toward. And I thought to myself, you know, we're talking about traumatized adults here. We're talking about people who have got to the later part of their lives who are experiencing all these manifestations, whether it be behaviorally, physical illness, whatever it looks like, manifestations of distressing experiences and emotional distress. And what we're doing is we're putting all this effort and all this work into being trauma-informed for adults and treating trauma in adults and learning how to recognize trauma in adults and in children. However, we are not implementing trauma-informed practice and care in the very places it should be implemented. That would be early childhood education and primary and secondary schools. So we get to learn as adults about trauma, and sometimes we might find a modality or a therapist, or we might find a body of work that we're reading or watching. We might do our own research and learn about how we've been impacted by trauma and figure out ways to help ourselves to start the healing process or recovery, and that's wonderful. But imagine if we could get in there during childhood. Imagine if we knew how to implement trauma-informed spaces for children. We do know how to do that. We're doing all the study and the research, and we're learning about it, and we're not doing it. So I think sometimes when parents are asking, what kind of accommodations do we ask for in IEPs or ILPs? Here in Australia, that stands for independent or individual learning plans or education plans. And I always want to encourage families and care teams to always return to safety at the centre of any kind of accommodation or practice. So if we're talking to our child's educators, if we're in a PSG, a meeting with educators, we can ask questions like, how can we provide this in a way that allows my child to feel safe? Because safety is absolutely at the heart of everything. It's the foundation of everything. So we talk about relational safety, which means safety in relationship, whether that be with a person, place, or thing. And so when we're talking about relational safety with educators, our hard reality is that we're not always going to get that. I'd love to sit here and say that all adults who work in education or other settings are open to being safe individuals for our children, but they're not. And then we're left with very little to work with when we're relying on another person to change who they are inherently when they're not willing to. So instead, we might be asking different questions about the process of implementing accommodations, approaches, practices. Now, if we look at things like positive behavioural support, that's in most school settings, and it is rooted, grounded in applied behaviour analysis. The problem with behaviorism and any kinds of programs or approaches that work up from a foundation of behaviorism, meaning our focus is on behavior and outcomes and changing that behavior. When we work from that space, our focus is not trauma-informed. It can never be trauma-informed. A person doesn't need to be traumatized for us to be working from a space of being trauma informed. What we're doing when we ensure that our practice or that we as personal individuals are trauma informed is that we're ensuring we're doing everything we can to learn how to be safe for those children, for those young people, for those adults. So a person or a child does not have to be traumatized for us to provide safety. That's aftercare. It's aftercare. Imagine if we just worked on being safe individuals and having safe organizations and companies and schools and practices and programs without our children having to be traumatized in the first place. So it's all well and good to come over and say, you know, now we have to implement this approach that's trauma informed because the child's traumatized. Imagine if we did it from the beginning. From the beginning, we implement approaches in schools that are trauma informed. We're not doing that. We're just not doing that. What we're doing instead is relying on really old, outdated information in textbooks about what autism is. And we're approaching that as though it's separate from an individual. It's this thing over here. Autism is this thing over here. It's an ism. And we've read about it in textbooks, and our professional development could come from people who are autistic themselves, but most of the time it doesn't. And we're still relying on that old information. We have these generic frameworks where we are, and I know I say this all the time, but we're putting dot points on a board, we're putting a timer on a kid's desk and telling them to have breaks. And we're assuming that we know everything about this individual in front of us because we've worked with autistic children for 20 years or we've worked in a specialist setting. It's like me saying, I understand chronic illness because I've worked in a hospital. It's not my lived experience. I can never truly understand the experience. I can learn from the person, but Christy, you don't know everything about everything. Isn't it amazing though how many people think they know everything about autism? This elusive thing over here that apparently is separate from the autistic person. There is no, here's a little secret, there's no autism, there's autistic people. And we don't just have a different neurotype, we have a completely different way of being. So being autistic for me is an identity and a culture. It's not a medical disorder. That doesn't mean it's not challenging to be me. It doesn't mean I don't experience disability. Doesn't mean autism's not a disability. But it doesn't mean I'm a second-rate version of a neurotypical that needs to be, what's the word I'm looking for? That needs to be trained into being a first-rate version of a neurotypical. Because what is that? You know, I'm so proud of being autistic. I'm so proud of who I am as an autistic person. But that doesn't mean that everything about me needs to be addressed as though I need to be helped. And being autistic and having autistic pride is so important, but sometimes we need to take a time out and say, let's put the word autism to the side for a second and remember the person in front of us. Now, that's not the same as saying autism doesn't define me, because it does. It does. I wouldn't be who I am if I wasn't autistic. But we're losing sight of the human beings in front of us. We're taking this elusive concept that we believe is separate from the individual, the autism over here, and we're forgetting who this person is. So if I'm teaching in a classroom and I have 5 autistic children, I would never assume that they all need the same thing, or that they all think the same way, or that they all have issues with or challenges with eating, or that they all have a sensitive sense of smell. There's just these generic stereotypical things written about autistic children, and the professional development for educators and people in allied health is so old and so outdated and so generic and boring and harmful that if it was actually helpful and helping, we wouldn't have the amount of children unable to walk into a building and receive an education. If what we were doing right now, if what we have done all this time was actually beneficial and helpful, when we're pulling it out of the old texts and reading autistic people, this is what they look like, this is what they sound like, this is how they think, these are their challenges. I mean, wow. But this is what people are being trained to do. So then we have these neurodivergent children coming out of that system, and then they're traumatized adults, and we wonder why. And we give the responsibility to them. And this is called the medical model of disability, where we go, you're disabled and you're responsible for that. Whereas the social model of disability says that we understand, accept, and appreciate all variations of human being and human doing, and we have a collective responsibility to build that foundation of safety for everyone. That's what community is. We don't have to be the same to be in community together, but we can be learning from each other. So, you know, like when I think about the NDIS as an example, the amount of people who are working in there who do not have experience with disability or any training, support workers who have come into my own home to support my family, and when I've asked about the training they have, sometimes they don't have any. And sometimes actually that can be a blessing, because you have this human being who comes into your home and gets to know your family on a personal, individual, heart-to-heart, connected, in community way, rather than this person's autistic, I know everything about what that means and how I should approach this. And the saddest part about this is that our families are being lied to around this as well. People have their children identified autistic, and then they are told your child will need generic framework, you guessed it. They're going to need occupational therapy. They are going to need speech therapy. They are going to need a psychologist. They might need some behavioral therapy. And nobody questions it. Nobody questions that. I didn't question that as a parent. I just didn't. And this is the initiation process for our families when their children are identified autistic, because the people that they go to see also have that training from those textbooks, the old stuff. And it is the old stuff. And, you know, when we talk about autistic pride is so hard to get. It is so hard to cultivate, because if you could imagine for a moment, and this is only one example of being in the world and being different and the constant messaging that you have growing up. You know, I didn't even know I was autistic, and I still perceived myself as wrong and othered and not okay and inherently flawed. Imagine how many human beings experience that. But being autistic, you don't need to know you're autistic to grow up with that and then to get into adulthood and be traumatized. If we are teaching our children at school about difference, it needs to be more than a conversation with an educator. So if we're talking to our children about the fact that disabled people exist, bring disabled people into the school to share their lived experience. If we're talking about Aboriginal culture and identity, bring Aboriginal people into the school to talk about country and their connections, and make it appropriate and make it applied learning, because we can talk about other people's experience all day, but we don't truly know and understand it. And it is so frustrating as an autistic person to watch my neurokindred be so completely traumatized, and to know that there are such basic, simple things we could be doing in early childhood to potentially prevent a lot of those outcomes. And we're not doing it. We're just not. Instead, we're looking at these outcomes of thousands and thousands of children not being able to access education. And by the way, the medical model of disability is applied to that situation as well. And we know that because the child is given the responsibility for that. They're called school refusers, as though, children in early childhood and primary years and secondary years are refusing, and nobody else is responsible, just the child, because they're refusing. So that's an outcome of behaviorism. So this is why behavior-based programs are really often unhelpful. Because if we're just focusing on a behavior, that's an end result. That's an outcome of an internalized experience that no one's paying attention to. So if we could get in there, teach our children that variations of human are normal and it's okay. And if we could teach autistic children that they are normal and that they're okay, they're more than okay. There are so many different versions of what normal is. If we could get in there and have these conversations with our children so that they're accepted and embraced by their peers, they have community from the beginning, instead of being cast out, segregated, set aside, put behind a wall, put into a completely different classroom, given this prescription of essentially accommodations that really don't help them to feel safe, but just other them. And if anything is outside of what we think those accommodations should be, it's very rarely delivered on. So coming back to when we're in those meetings and we're building IEPs, or we're asked, how can we support the child in the classroom? It's not always that simple. A classroom isn't always going to be a right fit for every child. And that doesn't mean there's something wrong with the child. Oh my gosh, I can't say this enough. If there are thousands and thousands of people from the same culture struggling with the same thing, just our children are at risk. They're at risk of missing out on an education, of missing out on community, of missing out on building a sense of self, of missing out on being proud of who they are, missing out on confidence, missing out on learning how to relate to others in a way that works for them. Because we take these children and we go, well, you don't socialize like everyone else, so we're going to teach you how to mimic socializing like everyone else. We're just going to ask you to oppress the fact that you prefer connection, one-on-one connection, heart-to-heart connection with human beings over socialization. We're going to ask you to oppress that. It's a beautiful quality, a beautiful set of values. But please, we're going to ask you to oppress that part of yourself and learn how to mimic the social skills of another culture. And while you're at it, can you stop moving so much? We want you to sit still so that you can take in the information, because that's how typical people learn, apparently. So please oppress what you need to do to be able to retain information and mimic doing it in a way that another culture does. This is what we do with neurodivergent people, not just neurodivergent people, anyone who's different, anybody who is different. We take them and we go, yep, okay, that's not the right way to think, feel, act, be, do. And we're going to train you so that you can mimic, you can pretend, you can mask how to not be who you are. So if that's our beginning point, where do we go from there? And, you know, there are programs and approaches and therapies that seem really harmless, but we have to ask ourselves, what might the experience of my autistic child be? And I want to give you an example from my own family. When my youngest was around 3, a speech pathologist came into our home and said, I think we could implement this program based around making friends. And I had a lot of questions and reservations about it. And I remember asking those questions and saying, why would a 3-year-old who is still in their formative years in a family who, really cultivates autistic pride? We are a completely autistic family. Our child's always known that they are autistic. Why would we take a 3-year-old in their formative years where they are processing so much more than the average child and put them in a position where they're being delivered a program that they won't be able to understand why they're doing this program? And, I can't remember what the response was to that, but I was sold this program on the premise that it would demonstrate to my autistic child how non-autistic people socialize and make friends, which in itself it's BS. It's absolute BS. Please stop telling people that anyone who's not autistic communicates in the same way as everybody else and socializes in the same way as everyone else across the planet. It's not true. We're being sold this information and we're buying it. But when you're autistic and you get to adulthood and you are healing and recovering from the trauma that is an outcome of those lies, we have a responsibility to start telling people, no matter what position we're in, it's not true. Because I feel a responsibility as an autistic adult to carve a different path for coming generations of autistic youth. And one of the ways that we do that is by encouraging our children to challenge current paradigms and information. So when my 3-year-old was sitting at a table being asked, what is the boy thinking? A hand-drawn illustration in a children's book. What is the boy thinking? What is the girl thinking? And I'm going to be completely honest, it was an image of a tower of blocks on half up and the other half on the floor. There was a girl there and a boy, and my child was asked, what is the boy thinking? And they apparently answered correctly. And I burst into fits of laughter because I had no idea what was going on in this illustration in the book. So had I been asked, what is the boy thinking? I would have given a very expansive, informed, critical thinking approached response, which would be, well, I don't know the boy. I don't know what his experience is. I don't know what his background is. I'm not sure what he's thinking. How could I possibly know what he's thinking? How could I possibly know what anyone's feeling based on what's happening here? Do we really all have the same facial expressions? Do we really all communicate in the same way and socialize in the same way? Of course we don't. We don't. It's rubbish. It's absolute rubbish. Needless to say, I don't want to be a part of the group plan. And that's code for the program that my child was exposed to. But I remember having this moment where I watched my child's face and I knew that they were uncomfortable because I know my child, and believe it or not, I know my child's expressions. And later on we had a conversation and they asked me, why was I doing that? What was that about? Why was I being asked those questions? And in that moment, I thought, sometimes when we are told that our children need these generic frameworks, the delivery of some of those therapies and those approaches, the idea of them, the confusion around why our children are doing them from their perspective and why their peers are not, can create more isolation and division and social anxiety and othering than the program initially intends. And do you know why? Because more often than not, they're created by non-autistic people. And how rude that a non-autistic person would create an entire program to teach an autistic person how to connect with other human beings. No lived experience. I don't care if they consider themselves non-autistic and they have autistic children. They still don't have lived experience. Their lived experience is parenting autistic people. The ignorance involved in doing that comes from the perspective that autism is a medical disorder, in the same way that a scientist can come up with a treatment for a medical condition that they haven't experienced themselves. This is where that thinking comes from. But this is my identity and my culture. This is a reclamation. Me saying that I am proudly autistic is a reclamation of a slur that has been used against my neurokindred for centuries now, because we've always existed. I'm not here because something happened that shifted something in here and caused me to be autistic. I was born perfectly whole and complete as an autistic person. So when we're in conversation with educators or allied health professionals or people supporting our children or our families, the questions can always be centered around safety, because it reminds the adults that we have a responsibility here. We actually have a duty of care, a legal and moral obligation to provide safety to all of the people in our care. So instead of saying things like, my child will need regular breaks, and being told, well, that's not possible because yada, 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 or, well, they can let me know when they need a break. And we know most of our children would never do that because they don't want to be othered. Instead, we might say, how might we provide moments across the day when my child is able to access being reconnected with safety? Because I know as an autistic adult that there are so many moments of feeling unsafe and unsure and disconnected when I'm away from being plugged in to a loving, safe, nurturing energy, whether that be our parents, our home base, our friends, our family, whatever it is. It might be a blankie, it could be a toy, it could be a tattoo, it could be anything. Whatever safety is for you is okay. It's important. So instead of arguing about, well, my child's not going to come and ask you for a break because they don't want to be othered, it could be a conversation about safety. So how can my child access safety when they're feeling unsafe? Because that's at the root of that fragile threat response for neurodivergent people, particularly PDAs and highly anxious people. Having that trip switch of a threat response means that the adults whose care we are in as children have a moral and legal responsibility, a duty of care to provide safety to us. So we use language that is formulated around that. And we're talking about being trauma-informed. So whenever my children begin a new school year or begin with a new therapist, or, they're talking to somebody about being autistic, a new support worker, I always start the relationship with these people by talking about autistic identity, whether that be, the times I've written a letter. Christy, we have a meeting and you're here watching me, aren't you? I'm so sorry. I'll be done in a minute. Just rant. It's been a long time. It's been a long time. I'm catching up on missed time. I can't remember what I was saying. That's probably a good thing. Oh, yes. Writing a letter to an educator and saying, it's so lovely to meet you. We are a proud autistic family and we practice our autistic culture in these ways. And one of them is that we do not consider ourselves medically or pathologically disordered. Instead, we consider that we are perfectly complete and whole and just autistic. And for us personally, we're not superheroes and we are not disorders. We're just different kinds of people, just neutralizing the term autistic. or ADHD or PDA, whatever. But the best way to be in relationship with an autistic person is to be trauma-informed and to be curious and open. Because I don't know about, my neurokindred here, but I'm so excited about meeting other people. Go figure. You wouldn't read that in a textbook about an autistic person, would you? I'm so excited about meeting new people that I'm so curious about who they are, where they come from, what lights them up, what's their trauma. I want to know all of that stuff because as an autistic person, I don't care for socialization. I care for connection. So when you read in the textbooks that autistic people do better with one-on-one connections rather than group settings, there's so many more reasons for that other than what you're reading in the book. What you'll read in the textbook is that we struggle, we get confused with all the conversations and we really struggle to keep up and we don't know what to do. And sometimes, yeah, that's absolutely true, but that's not the be all and end all. But you're going to read that because it's deficit-based and we don't talk about autistic strengths in a realistic way. Because what if you're an autistic person and you're not gifted at technology and IT, or you're not a savant, or you can't recite a piano piece after hearing it once, or you're not a maths prodigy? What then? What will people read about us in the textbooks? If we're not severely autistic or severely deficited, or we're not a prodigy, then what are we? We're just autistic people, garden variety autistic people. So we get to talk about that and we get to do it proudly. I am a proud autistic person. My child is really excited to start a new school year with you and to get to know you. And something that's really important to my child as your student is relationships with others. I know that you may not have read that about autistic people, but many of us really value being connected and being in relationship. And you can say whatever you like about what autism means for you or your child. And I'm going to stop talking because I'm supposed to be in a meeting and I got carried away, and it's so lovely to be back. And thank you so much, everyone, for holding space for me to info dump. I'm so grateful for this community. It's been so beautiful and so healing. Just this has been so healing. Okay. Thanks, everyone. Okay, I'm going. I'm really going. Have a wonderful week.